Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our 2023 PD Extravaganza. We are here today on this Thursday afternoon with Jude Krushnowski, Director of the Foreign Language Teacher Education Program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Today, we'll be speaking about unpacking rubrics for proficiency-based language teaching, where we're going to learn if our rubrics meet expectations as he told us about. We have a survey at the end of the presentation. Make sure you fill it out and you can get an entry into our giveaway, as well as to give Jude some feedback on his presentation. And if you have any questions at any time in the chat, I'm sure you can put them there and Jude will be happy to answer them. And without further ado, Jude, take it away. Tell us about rubrics.
All right. Thank you, Grant. Well, welcome to everyone. Thanks for sharing a lovely Thursday afternoon to speak about rubrics. The objectives for today that I have for everyone are to, be able to design and modify rubrics to communicate expectations and priorities for learning. That's the goal for this presentation, for this talk. Also, we want to be able to engage students and include them in the rubric design process, because at the end of the day, our rubrics, right, are tools for students to get feedback and to learn. And we also want then to be able to implement rubrics to provide meaningful feedback and promote self-assessment, right? We're providing feedback to students via our rubrics, but then also students can in turn use our rubrics to assess their own work. It makes it a more powerful tool. So those are the three objectives we have going forward. We'll go ahead and just jump right in. We're going to start off with an answer garden. The link is in the chat. Hopefully everyone can access it. But I want to get us thinking about what are the characteristics of an effective rubric. So using only adjectives, please include answers and separate responses, but what are some adjectives that describe an effective rubric? So please keep your answers separate, right? So one adjective at a time. I want to get a sense from everyone, what are some adjectives that come to mind when we think about an effective rubric? So okay, perfect. And we can use the chat as well if we don't want to use the answer garden. There is the link in the chat. But the chat might even be an easier tool. But either at the answer garden or in the chat. So clear from Maureen. Thank you, Maureen. Wonderful. Wonderful response. Let's see. Stop sharing. There we go. So what are some other adjectives? Meaningful, yes. All right, good. Johanna, meaningful. So we have clear, we have meaningful. Think about the best rubric you've ever seen. How would you describe it? Easy. Okay. Oh, I like that, May. Easy. All right. Short. Ooh, all right. You're welcome, May. What other? Yes, right. Short, not too long, easy, clear, meaningful, right? I think that really sums up or captures what we're going for when we are writing rubrics. And so before we get too far along, I think everyone here we've got a group of 20-some folks. Everyone here has different experiences with using rubrics to assign grades. And I just wanted to get a sense, when you are assigning grades, what scale are students using, or what scale are you using to give students their grades? Is it a traditional ABC scale? Is it a standards-based or mastery-based, exceeding, meeting, approaching scale, or is it something else? Okay, percentages, all right. Traditional, okay. AA, okay. Traditional. B converted to A, yes, I'm familiar with that. Karen, okay. B convert to percentages, right, okay. So kind of a hybrid of using the standards-based rubrics converted to a traditional grade. Okay, and then so Myrna, you have a standards-based, wonderful, where students are seeing their grades as exceeding, meeting, approaching, etc. Okay. Sounds like we're looking at mostly a traditional scale, some hybrid, and then some who are using the standards-based, a pure standards-based model, which in my opinion is phenomenal. I'm a little bit biased towards standards-based grading, but That's not quite the topic. We're talking about rubrics, which clearly interface with traditional grading scales and standards-based grading. So that is good background information for me to have. Maureen, a little of everything. All right. So when we're jumping into rubrics, right, we have two types of rubrics. We've got holistic rubrics and analytic rubrics. And we're going to be focusing on analytic rubrics in this talk. But I just wanted to cover both and just do a little bit of a comparison. So both depend on the criteria to assess performance, right? So both have a list of criteria that that is being used to evaluate student performance with different levels, right? So there's 4, 3, 2, 1 might be the scale that you're using, but there's still different levels of performance for an analytic rubric and a holistic rubric. However, the two differ in that analytic rubrics tend to provide, they're better at providing feedback along specific criteria, right? And so that's why we're going to be focusing on analytic rubrics for this talk, because one of the goals is to be able to provide feedback to our students and to have them use our rubrics as tools for self-assessment. It's not to say that holistic rubrics don't have any benefits, right? They're good for a quick evaluation with limited feedback, right? They're still providing some feedback, but it's not as thorough or in-depth or clear and precise, right, as analytic rubrics. And they are good for quick evaluations. So we can maybe think of perhaps a presentation, in-class presentation that we're listening to students speaking about something, and we're quickly, right, circling the criteria or circling the level, right, based on a holistic approach to assessing that performance. One of the benefits of Extempore, the host of this PD Extravaganza, is that you can go back and listen to those presentations multiple times, so you don't need to do it as quickly, and then you can perhaps use an analytic rubric. But right, that is one of the features of holistic rubric. It is better for that. But for our purposes, we're going to stick with analytic rubrics in this talk. And no matter which rubric that you use, rubrics, or which type of rubric, right, your rubrics will communicate our expectations, so your expectations for your students, and your priorities, right, for your students. And so we're going to be looking at those expectations and priorities and how our rubric design affects what we're saying to our students, what we're prioritizing in our classroom and in their learning. All right. So we're going to take a look at a number of things. We're going to look at criteria, performance levels, descriptions, and language. Okay. When it comes to criteria, right, we're referring to these boxes on a rubric. So if we look at this rubric, perhaps this looks similar to a rubric that we use, that we hold near and dear to our hearts, that we use in our own classes. Maybe it looks a little bit different, but the boxes on the left-hand side, right, the ones that are highlighted in red, when we say criteria, those are the criteria that we're referring to, right? Those boxes. And so I think this comes back to, was it, I think maybe May's point, I think in the chat, making rubrics short. And so we'll kind of come back and touch upon that a little bit in a little bit. But so when we're looking at criteria, right, we want to think about backwards design, right? So if we're starting with our objectives and our goals in mind for what we want students to be able to do, then we want to choose criteria that align with those goals, right? That allow us to see if students have met those goals or not, right? So we want to be very mindful about the criteria that we're choosing. If we take a look at, for example, the criteria here, you know, when we think about teaching for proficiency, are there any criteria or any criteria that, or any particular criterion that sticks out to us as maybe something that gives us pause as we take a look at this list of criteria? Okay, vocabulary. Task completion equals good. Okay, Valencia. Okay, grammar. Separating grammar and vocab equals no good. All right. Anything else? So what about creativity? Comprehensibility, yes. Oh, very good, Grant. All right. Yes, creativity, pretty subjective. And also, can you speak or be proficient in a language without being creative? Probably. So creativity might not be representative of language proficiency, right? Language control, okay. Okay, so language control jumps out. So ChatGPT is not creative, okay, but it could maybe pass itself off as proficient. Different from creates with language, right? Okay, good distinction. Language passion. Okay, or language functions. I think that, yes, so thumbs up. Right, text type. Okay, so we want to be mindful of which criteria we're choosing, right? We have 8 here. Do we need all 8 in our rubric? Probably not. And it depends on what our goals are for our students and what we want to assess in their work. So we want to simplify. I think this goes back to May's point of a shorter rubric, right? So not too many categories. As Susan Brookhart said, effective rubrics do not list all possible criteria. They list the right criteria for the assessment's purpose, right? And so it depends on what is the purpose of the assessment. If we're assessing, for example, if it's a speaking assessment, we certainly do not need to have grammar, vocabulary, language control, comprehensibility. We don't need all of them, right? We need to select criteria, and we'll take a look at that in a second. We want to avoid overlap. And so some of us mentioned, I think was Florencia mentioned, separating grammar and vocab is no good. So let's take a look at something like this. So when we look at overlap, how might these represent areas of overlap? If we had all 3 of these on the rubric, what's a potential outcome that might be less than ideal for our students? Overemphasis on one element of the assignment. If you use correct grammar, you're more comprehensible. So kind of the same thing, right? So if students make grammatical errors, then they might not be comprehensible. And that also likely ties into language control, depending on how you describe it in your rubric. Oh, there we go. And then Noreen. Wonderful. No risk taking. Exactly. Sticking to formulaic phrases. So we're telling our students, when we come back to our expectations and priorities, we're saying that we prioritize correct grammar, we prioritize correct formulaic phrases, and we don't want students taking risks. And students are afraid to take risks because they don't want to get creative with language in a way that maybe creates the possibility or increases the possibility of making errors with grammatical structures, right? And we tell them that we're prioritizing correct grammar. Impact task completion to an extent, sure. And then when I think Grant brought up ChatGPT, and if we are hyper-focusing on grammar, then what's going to happen? Well, students might turn to things like ChatGPT or Google Translate, because at the end of the day, we care more about the grammar than what they actually have to say, right? So we want to be very careful that we're not, that we're avoiding overlap in the criteria that we choose in our rubrics. Another example might be vocabulary and text type, right? So if students are only able to produce lists or short sentences for their text type, but we have an expectation in our rubric that students are using robust vocabulary, well, they can only produce shorter text types. so they're not going to be able to use that robust vocabulary. So we want to be careful that we're not dinging them twice. Right, okay, May, well said. So again, we want to make sure that we are avoiding overlap, right, in our criteria. So as we look at our rubrics, it's important to see and to think about, well, maybe this grammar and language control, we can combine those, or grammar and comprehensibility, maybe we can combine them, or maybe we don't need grammar because we already have comprehensibility, right? And if we do want to target a grammar point, we can always provide feedback, right, at the end. And so this way we don't need that separate grammar section. Depends on the level, of course. So reconsider, and then we want to also, again, majority of us here are operating with a traditional grading scale. Some of us are converting from an SVG rubric to a traditional grading scale. And so grades are still important. We can't get away from the ABC or the percentages. And so we want to reconsider weighting for our rubrics. So here's an example from the great Florencia Henshaw, who is in the chat with us. This is a rubric that she graciously provided. And so when we look at this rubric, we notice that we have 3 criteria: ability to provide information, comprehensibility, and ability to ask questions. But we also notice that we go 4, 3, 2, 1 for the first 2 criteria. So they're weighted out of 4 points. But for these, for ability to ask questions, it's actually out of 2 points. It's 1 or 2 for ability to ask questions. So in this way, right, again, this rubric is for intermediate low. Okay, so asking questions is a very emergent skill at this point in their language development. And so it isn't quite as important to ask questions. So we don't want to weight as much as something like comprehensibility or provide information. And so we can weight it lower, right? We can give it a lower weight so that we're not penalizing students as much for a skill that perhaps they're not as strong in. We still want to see them develop that skill, but numerically, we don't want to penalize students for a skill that, you know, it is still very emergent in their language development. So would ability to provide information the same thing as language function? If to some extent, yes. There's considerable overlap between ability to provide information and language function. So, right. We want to be mindful then of, in the context of that, yes. Right, so thank you, Myrna. Wonderful question. Thank you, Florencia, for the clarification. It was an interview, okay. And so we want to be mindful of those criteria when we're selecting them. Once we've selected our criteria, we then want to establish performance levels that are appropriate for our students. And so we want to use appropriate labels in our rubrics, of course. So as we see here, this is a rubric from Carla. So it's strong performance, meets expectations, approaching expectations, and not rateable. So these are okay performance levels. We want to use appropriate levels. We want to avoid labels such as poor or weak, right? We want to avoid a deficit mindset when we look at rubrics and when we look at feedback. So we want to always focus on growth. So language such as approaching is, you know, more encouraging than something along the lines of poor or weak, where we're pointing out that students are deficient in some way. We want to use language that is more encouraging. In the same vein, and I could go on and on about this topic, but I'll keep it short and sweet here, but I'm happy to go on longer. But exceeds expectations is something that I think needs to be reconsidered in many rubrics. It ends up being problematic in some ways because we're telling students that we want them to go beyond what they're taught to do. or what we've been teaching them to do, what our goal has been. So we want them to go beyond, but how can they go beyond if they have not received the preparation to exactly go beyond, right? And so if we're reserving our highest grade for those who go beyond what they've been taught to do, it becomes a question of equity to some extent as to, can we give only the highest grade then to students who are able to go beyond? Yes, Noreen, wonderful. And so, right, Noreen, excellent. Yes, okay. They're working into the next level, right? And so and Karen, so Noreen, wonderful. If I could figure out emojis, I would. Wait, I think I did an emoji. Karen, also well said. So Karen, yes, right. To the extent that they're working to the next level in a purely SBG, a purely standards-based or purely mastery-based framework, you're right. Whereas they are exceeding the standard and moving to a new standard, in which case, right, in a purely standards-based grade book, there wouldn't be a penalty for not getting exceeding. However, when we're converting our grades to a traditional grade book, right, it becomes an issue because students then are only able to get that A. If exceeds expectations equals an A in a traditional grade book, then it becomes a problem, right? Okay, so then Karen, it sounds like in your system, meeting is an A. So I love that. And that would be one of my suggestions, right? Setting meeting as the A so that you can, but keeping exceeds so that some students can get that feedback if they are in that area, right? That performance level, but not penalizing those students who are at target. Where working meeting is an 87. Okay, super. Okay. How does this contribute to grade inflation? That is a philosophical question. If we're focused on mastery and student learning, well, if grades are a reflection of learning and mastery and not a ranking, then it does not, it seems like we're talking across each other. Yes, it might contribute to grade inflation, but if we have clearly defined standards of performance, right? If we have clearly defined levels and students are hitting the levels that we're defining, perhaps we're setting the levels then too low if all of our students are meeting them. And so there's some, perhaps we can increase those standards. If all of our students are meeting our standards, then there's a case to be made then that we can set them higher because students are able to reach a higher standard. Or maybe we're awesome instructors. Also true. I mean, that is already the case since we're here attending this extempore PD extravaganza. However, I would say that if we are worried about grade inflation and we are seeing that all of our students are scoring at meeting, then perhaps we can readjust, recalibrate our standards. And then, so Thomas Gusky has done extensive work on this and recommends words like excellent, exemplary, distinguished in lieu of exceeds expectations. So, yes, okay. Okay. Oh, okay, Grant, I'm curious about not everyone acquired. Yes. Right. So not everyone acquires language at the same time. Right. And so it's good and that's why, moving on to the next point, we want to have a clear difference between levels. We want to be able to capture a range, right? We want to capture a range of performance. So to Grant's point, right, not everyone acquires language at the same rate. Well said. And so we want to be able to capture that range, and we're not expecting students to all be at the same range at the same time. And that's why it's important to, be able to capture that range. If we set meeting as an A and we reserve maybe that higher bracket as still an A, right? But there to provide feedback. That's one way that we can kind of capture that range of proficiency. So I hope that kind of, instead of exceeding, which words, oh, right. So instead of exceeding, exemplary, distinguished, excellent, right? And it might seem like these are just changes of words. Sustains performance at level, wonderful. And so these are simple changes of language. However, to a student, right, we'll talk about the student side of things, it can come across a little bit demotivating if you're being told you must go above and beyond the standard to get an A, right? So, right, we want to use language like maybe exemplary, distinguished, excellent, as just to give some examples. And also on that topic, right, we want to shoot for the highest level that we want students, or that we expect students to get to, right? So there are some approaches to creating rubrics based on like Marzano approach, in which we set the level 3 of the rubric to our highest goal. However, Gusky and others have pointed out that we want to set the highest level of student achievement to the highest rank on the rubric, right? So that students are shooting to the highest end of the rubric. And so there are certain ways that we want to reconsider this exceeds expectations, reconsider asking students to do beyond what they're being taught to do. Right. So, right. In terms of, thank you, Florencia. In terms of performance descriptions, right? So we have our criteria, we have our levels, right? Now we need to take a look at what the descriptions look like, right? What kind of descriptions are we writing in our rubric? How are we capturing that range of performance? And so our descriptions, right, should be developmentally appropriate, something that we've touched on. So something that we've touched on already. So we want them to be, based on the actual proficiency guidelines or can-do statements or performance benchmarks, or if you're using something like WIDA, based on the WIDA standards, we want them to be based on, guidelines that are developmentally appropriate. So we're not telling students, at the novice level that they should be writing paragraphs, for example, right, for their text type. We want to make sure that they are descriptions that are developmentally appropriate, that are observable, right, that we can see in their language, that we can see in their writing, that we can point to and say, here's what you did, here's how you can improve. I like this aspect of your work. And then focus on what students can do with the language, right? So are they able to provide information? Are they able to ask questions? Are they able to be understood, right? Are they able to answer questions? Are they able to give details? And so being able to focus on what students do with the language, as opposed to perhaps something like a checklist, provides 3 adjectives, maybe something for like along those lines, like you might see in some rubrics. So what are students doing with the language? Okay. Can do the actual purpose of the equals the actual purpose of the assignment. Say more, Rachel. Right. Okay. So like the actual can do statements are a list of what students can do, right, at different levels. And so keeping that in mind, we want to make sure that we're describing performance that is within our students' ability level. Present on a topic, right? So present on a topic, we want to make sure that we're talking about content that is within the student's ability level, right? Text type that's within the student's ability level. And so we want to make sure that if they're presenting on a topic, that we're being mindful of what students can produce at the level that they're at, what students can talk about at the level that they're at, so that we don't end up writing rubrics that, for example, have the expectation that students will write multiple paragraphs at the novice level, because then we end up wondering, why do students use Google Translate, for example, right? So we want to focus on what students can do with the language, and make sure that they're developmentally appropriate. And this ties, the next one ties back in to our previous conversation, starting with the highest level that students can achieve in class. Okay, so if we take a look at this rubric here, when we're writing our rubric, so in this rubric, we would start with the strong performance, right? And that would be the first level of descriptions that we write. We start at the very, very top, right? And then we work our way down in terms of what we would expect students at lower levels to produce, okay? So this is a little bit of a change from other ways of writing rubrics where you would write maybe this column here, the meets expectations column. And then you would work your way down and then maybe make up something just above meets expectations. Well, we should set the highest goal to what we think our students can achieve, right? Can accomplish in class, and then work our way down from there, okay? So I wonder if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's a little bit confusing, but that's a bit of a change. That's something that, you know, has been written about quite a bit by Gusky and others. And I think there's value in that, just for that equity piece that I mentioned about being able to ask students or asking students to produce something beyond what they've been taught to do. So as we look at our descriptions, what about these descriptions stands out to us? Is there anything that, if we saw these on one of our rubrics, we would say, love it, or we would say, no, please no, I need to fix this. Does any of these stand out to us? Does any of these give us pause? If you were a student, would you understand it? If you were yourself said that we're all wonderful educators, would you yourself understand it? Okay, familiar versus new for vocab gives me pause. Okay. I don't know if E would be clear to a high schooler. All right, good, Grant. The language is not very student friendly. All right, Catherine. What is F? I can complete the task by using a variety of learned statements and questions. What? Yes, Grant, what the F? Okay, a variety of learned statements and questions. So I can read it, but I do not get it. Okay, all right. Yes, all right, wonderful, Karen, and we'll touch on that as well. So thank you for bringing that up. So, okay, so Grant clearly struck a nerve. He's, I think, the emoji champion right now with 5 recorded emojis in response to his comment. Right, so I can complete the task by using a variety of learned statements and questions. Yeah, that needs to be unpacked, right? What is the task? What are you doing? I can do X thing, right? What is the task, right? Learn statements and questions, still unclear. To Karen's point, some kind of a model would be needed, right? So that students can see what exactly is it that what is this saying? Also, I think it was also Grant or someone pointed out that E, right? Most utterances are difficult to understand even by a sympathetic interlocutor. Yeah, learn statements just about everything for students, right? Well said. Yeah, so what is a sympathetic interlocutor? If you walked up to your student and said, who is a sympathetic interlocutor? Okay. Learned statements. Yes, yeah, I'm also a fan, Aaron, of using first person rubrics, especially for self-assessment, right? So I certainly appreciate the use of first person as well. But for, sympathetic interlocutor, a little bit unnecessarily jargony. I don't know what does that mean? I can difficult to understand even via sympathetic interlocutor. Students might get lost there. Needs to be defined, right? So, okay, I don't think no one really took issue with C, accurate, fully developed, and supported. D, good one, able to respond to most of the questions with single sentences or sentence fragments. Right, and that's something that is observable, right? We can see students responding, we can look at the text type that they're producing, and so that is something that we can clearly, right, students can see it and we can see it as well. There we go. To be fair, maybe she was primed for that since we'd already seen that one in a previous slide. But any errors in structures are infrequent and do not interfere with communication, right? So also, this is one where we're targeting errors in structures, language control or grammar, but then also bringing in that comprehensibility piece, right? So that we're not targeting two separate criteria at the same time, right? I mean, we're targeting them in one criteria level, and we don't have two separate levels on our rubric. So we're kind of merging them into one criterion so that we can target those things without penalizing the student against or across two separate criteria. Okay, so these are some descriptions, right? And we agree that some are better than others, some are more concrete than others, some are clearer than others. And so we want clarity. I forget who, hold on, I'm going to scroll back up to the top of the chat because I apologize for missing, but Maureen said clear when we started things as to what adjectives we would use to describe rubrics. Yes, clarity is key. We want them to be clear for sure. Clear and precise language so that students understand, so that we know what we're seeing, students know what they're producing and can identify and self-assess. Not too technical. So in the case of sympathetic interlocutor, we could just say the teacher. I mean, more than likely, we, the teachers, are going to be the ones assessing the student language. So we could just say the teacher, and avoids the imaginary interlocutor. So, right, we could just say the teacher, and then the student knows, oh yeah, okay, the teacher, and then it's not some imaginary other person, right? It's just the teacher, and it makes it more realistic for students. Right. So we want to make sure that the language is not too technical. It's clear, precise, comprehensible to students. Okay. So, if we look at a rubric like this, perhaps, for text type, we might use, so our criterion here might be text type. If we're doing presentational speaking for novice high, we use the criterion text type. And this is just an example for what that language can look like across the different levels. So across text type, we'll have excellent, where they use short and discrete sentences, which for novice high, yes, that's right where we want to be. We have good, right? Or we could have strong, but it's language that represents something, not excellent, but still strong, still good. They're on the right track. Uses short, sometimes incomplete sentences and memorized phrases. Okay. Approaching, so we're avoiding strong, or we're avoiding weak or poor or deficient or lacking, right? And so isolated words and memorized phrases, right? And we can imagine seeing student work that looks like this, right? It's just a few words, maybe it's a phrase or two that students kind of cobbled together, like memorized chunks from class, but there's a clear difference between this level and this level and this level. And then finally at the beginning level, right, just isolated words. So not even phrases. And so this would be an example of like what that clear language would look like across those different levels so that students know what we're expecting of them and so that we're clearly communicating what it is that we're expecting. So we want to be mindful of that language when we're putting together our rubrics. So I do want to touch on the student side of things, how to engage students, but I'm not sure if anything in terms of rubric design, if we had any kind of questions, concerns, quandaries. All right, if so, put them in the chats. We'll talk about engaging students, right? So what strategies do you use to include students in the rubric design process? Do you include students? Do you not include students? What do you do to help students? None, not allowed. Okay, all right. Wish, okay. Okay. Haven't, but sounds great. I show them the rubric, okay. Haven't tried it, okay. So said, oh, okay, good, Karen, all right. Okay. Good, so we'll talk about some strategies that we can use. For those who are familiar with the Charlotte Danielson framework, there is an emphasis, especially at the higher end, placed on having students co-construct a rubric. And so we could talk a little bit about what that could look like. We're going to focus primarily, however, on assuming that we have a pre-made rubric, right? How we can get students engaged in using the rubrics that we have, because it sounds like in the context many have described here, we have our rubrics, I think, as Florencia mentioned early on, already prepared for the semester or for the year. And so we can't really, tweak them on the fly as easily. So let's take a look at some things that we can do, some strategies. So we can elicit student feedback. We can practice with work samples, and we can do self-assessment. So when we talk about student feedback, we can, I believe it was, okay, Gisela said, I show the rubric to my students. I think Aaron also said, I show them the rubric, right? So we can show them the rubric, and then we can ask them, like, are the criteria clear, right? Are there clear differences between the categories or levels? Like, do you understand what the difference between excellent and good is, or between good and approaching? And maybe students will say yes, maybe students will say no, maybe they'll be puzzled. But we want to, one strategy is just to get that student feedback, so that we're not just saying, here's the rubric, now follow it, because if students don't understand the rubric, then they can't use it to self-assess, and they can't use it to guide their performance in our classes and on their assessments. Is there any confusing language? Do you know what an sympathetic interlocutor is? Point to the nearest sympathetic interlocutor. Do you know who that person is? Right. So is there confusing language in your rubric? And so we can get student feedback in that way, right? And that's a very kind of passive way of asking students, do you understand or not? But it's still something that we can use to kind of get students thinking about, reflecting on the language and giving us feedback as to, do they understand it or not? Another thing we can do is using work samples. This one requires a little bit of building. Yes. Karen, love that. So we can provide students with work samples or exemplars of each level, right? And have them match them with the appropriate levels on the rubric. So this is very much matching, right? So we have the work sample, and we have students match them with different levels on the rubric. And then students can also be provided with a leveled work sample, and they can work in pairs to individually assess it using the rubric. And so I think that's exactly what Karen pointed out. Right, or post the rubric, right, so that students have access to it. But sometimes students don't read the syllabus, sometimes students don't read the rubrics, and so sometimes we need to be a little more focused and intentional with On the wall. Okay, good. Realist example is right. So yes. Okay, very good point. Florencia, right. We want to make sure that we're not just showing them perfect examples. And of course, we're not showing them just the high level also, right? The idea is to show them leveled work samples so that they can see what does a work sample look like at, each level. So not just perfection, but also, right, what does it look like? And maybe even the highest level will still have some errors in it, right? Because we're not expecting perfection from them. So yes, great point. And then compare student ratings as a class to identify areas of confusion, right? So, okay, class, we have work sample A. What rating do we think this one should receive, right? And so if there's a lot of confusion, well, it looks like excellent. Well, it looks like good. Well, actually, it looks like approaching. Then that means a few things for us as the teacher. The language is probably not clear, or students just don't have a clear enough understanding, right, of what the differences are between those levels. And so that gives us feedback so we can go back at the rubric, right? We can go back, look at the rubric, and then co-construct that language that'll help us see what the clear difference is between each of those levels, right? So it's a one way to have students work with their rubrics, work with some work samples. This one does take a little bit of prep because you need to find those good work samples. You could write them yourself. If they're actual work samples, students tend to feel better about seeing things that other students have done. But if you have to write them yourself, that's okay too. The important thing is to have students reflect and utilize the rubric to assess a sample and then compare and see if there are areas of breakdown. And then, right, we can do self-assessment where we have students, they can complete some kind of a task and then assess their own work using the rubric before they submit it for grading, right? So they can sit down, they complete it, and then using the rubric, they assess their own work. And then what we can do is have students compare the teacher's rubric afterwards with the rubric they submitted and see, right, where was the breakdown? Here, I thought I did excellent, but I actually did good. I got a good on this. Where was the disconnect, right? And so, this one, of course, requires students to complete something, self-assess, teacher to assess it, but it's part of an ongoing process, right, of making sure that students are using the rubric to assess their own work for learning. Realistic examples is crucial to reinforce students' confidence. Yes. Need realistic examples. If we just show them perfect, here is a perfect presentation that a student did, forever ago, and we have not seen another such perfect example since, then students might think, well, I can't produce that. Or if it just, here's an example that the teacher made, look how good it is. And the students just might become demotivated because, well, I'm not the teacher, right? Of course, it's easy for you, the teacher, because you're the teacher. So yes, we want realistic examples for sure that students have, that other students have made. Yes. So Tanya, thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay. Ooh. And then Jason, I used to keep physically and then realistic photos of work samples. Yeah. All right. Good. Using technology to make things easier, more accessible. Also, yes. So great point, Florencia, right? Sometimes the differences that we see in the language we're teaching, it stands out to us, but for students, it's not that clear. And so showing them examples in English, right, can also help make clear what we're targeting, right, with our language and our rubric. So in terms of giving feedback, right, so we have now co-constructed our perfect rubric, right? Students know what we expect. Students know what the different levels are, what the different criteria are. In terms of giving feedback, we want to leverage the rubric language, right? And what does that mean? Well, if we're writing our descriptions, using the different strategies that we discussed previously, if the language is precise, if it's comprehensible, if students, there's no jargon, students are able to understand what each level, looks like, right? Then well-written rubrics can serve as feedback in themselves, right? You can identify, you can indicate to the student the level, and that language to some extent is feedback, right? It's not as robust as it can be, but it's a pretty good starting point for providing feedback. We can't always write individualized feedback for our students. That would be the ideal. But a good starting point is to at least, show them on the rubric where they are. So leveraging that rubric language is very important. When we do
Hold
write,
on, can I just
yes,
say,
yes,
in my school, it's not just check in a box in the rubric. It takes me, this is not an exaggeration, I wish it was, but it's not. If the speaking assessment takes, let's say, 8 minutes per student, because we give them like 4 to 5 questions at the end of each unit as part of the IPA, at speaking for 2 minutes, at least in level 4, for 2 minutes each student. So that's about, depending on, let's say 4 questions, that's 8 minutes. It's not just a check in the rubric. We have to give them feedback, what they did, and then give them also the feedback on what they need to do to improve before they take the next speaking assessment.
right. And again, that's a situation where you have to provide the individualized feedback. I'm saying that if you're in a situation where you don't have to provide that level of detail, the rubric is a good starting point for where you can just check. But my next points are about those situations, right, where you have to provide feedback on how students can improve for the next assessment, right? So corrective feedback takes a lot of time, feedback in general, a lot of time. And so if we're investing this time, to your point, we want to make sure the students are getting as much out of it as possible. And so we want to make sure that we're leaving actionable comments and being specific, right? And avoiding general comments like, good job, great work, keep it up. And so provide actionable comments. We want to recognize areas of strength and growth, right? So who wants to read comments that are just like, do this, change this, do this. Let them know what they did right, glow and grow. Love that. Yes. A private video on flip can be, yes, for sure. Jason, the next cell shows what they can do to improve. Yes, exactly. Karen, well said. And so recognize areas of strength and growth, glow and grow, which is something I'm going to steal. Thank you, Myrna. So recognize areas of strength and growth. Be strategic. You don't have to comment about everything, right? And so if there are maybe some errors with a particular structure, or students are using a particular word incorrectly, you can focus on the words or the structures that cause the most breakdown in communication, but not necessarily, everything, right? And this way you're saving yourself time, and also you're increasing the chances that the student, actually takes some of that information to heart. I asked them to review, right? Because if, again, you don't want to overwhelm students with 40 comments, when you can just prune them down and make sure that 10 comments, maybe not even 10, but fewer comments are more actionable, more specific, more targeted. Okay, super. And so that's what you do, and it still takes time, right? It still takes time. And so, Extempore allows for audio feedback. I was just going to plug Extempore, and somebody also mentioned Flip as well. So with Extempore, you can leave a video response, and it feels more personal that way. Also, Flip, you can leave a video response as well. So Canvas allows for spoken. Okay, right. It depends on your LMS as well, right? Which might allow you to embed a video. So, and you could even if you just simply use Google Classroom, upload a video for your student, it's not as user-friendly, but there are ways where, so if it is easier for you to just simply speak to them, then maybe that saves some time, right? It certainly makes it more personalized for students. But, all right, so we want to, not everything requires feedback. What about these examples of feedback? Does any of these stand out to us? No on B. All right. Aaron is not a fan of B. Yeah. Cosigned, no on B. Don't forget to include the auxiliary with your present perfect verbs. Oof. C isn't bad. Examples would help. Okay, you connect ideas, your ideas well with a variety of transition words. A is too vague. Add more details. Right. Add examples A and C. I like adding, if I'm going to give. So C is okay. I think for C, you would likely have it. You would have something underlined, I believe. You'd be underlining something. If it's written, maybe something would be underlined. Or if it is in a presentation, perhaps you can identify, right, like provide an example, right? You would need to kind of illustrate that point. If it's in writing, it's a little bit easier. B, nobody likes B. Nobody's a fan of B. But saying something positive is certainly, right, you connected these ideas well. If you're telling students they did something well, you want to make sure to point it out, that they understand what they did well. For A, if I'm going to leave a comment like A, I'm going to want to ask questions, right? So instead of just saying add more details, ask them some questions. And especially if we're dealing with, if students are at the intermediate level or certainly the advanced level, right? Our questions in the target language can then become additional input for them, right? But if we ask them questions about the details that we want them to add, right? It helps them identify, okay, so in the future, these are the kinds of questions that I'll be, that's it. Oh, okay. Oh, whoops. Well, you know what they say, great minds. So, okay. So, can be changed for practice on grammar structure. Would that be fair? Ooh, say more. Don't forget to include when they obviously forgot, right? Right. So to Myrna's point, change can be changed for practice on. I mean, for B, you can just provide them with an example of maybe the structure that they, created the mistake on, and then correct it with the structure being added. At least that way they're seeing the correction as opposed to this very metalinguistic language that they might not even know what it means. B might be a form of assessment comments. Okay. Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if we mean grammar practice in terms of a separate drill activity or something along those lines. Right. Okay. Yes. Right. And so phrasing your feedback in the form of a question, I think, is very powerful, because then students have to engage in the content to answer your question, right? You can't just cannot do it even in a native language. Right. So we asked, I've had high schoolers who can't identify the verb, and I was a little bit nervous asking all of us to identify adjectives, and then I realized, well, we're all teachers here, we can do that. But yes, even high schoolers can identify verbs or nouns sometimes. So raise the students. Okay. Super. Okay. Right. So good comment from Noreen there. Okay. Bold it. So make it stand out. Maybe some input enhancements. Okay. So these are some ways, right? So these are some examples of feedback and different ways that we can improve them, right? We can improve our feedback leading skills. Unfortunately, feedback takes time, but there is benefit in it, and we just want to make sure that we're being as efficient and strategic as possible with our feedback so that we're not overwhelming students. And so then we're also not, burning ourselves out in an effort that doesn't quite go anywhere, right? If we spend 3 hours leaving 47 comments and students only read the first 3, it's really not beneficial to anyone. So we want to be strategic with our feedback as well. Oh, that is, we're at time. So thank you very much for the active participation from everyone. This is the link for feedback. So are there 2? There are 2. Grant, which one is a better one?
Okay, well, I'm not going to assess the rubric that I gave you on which link to include. No, only kidding. But it's the PD feedback one, right there. Yeah, that is the link that we have been using. Yes, yeah, and thank you, Jude. I mean, my gosh, the timing. Talk about impeccable. Exceeds expectations. I just have to. Right. Well done. It was a lovely presentation, and if I may. A shameless plug for Extempore. Our rubrics are getting totally revamped. It's like been literally all we have talked about here at our office for the past couple months. So a lot of exciting things that we can incorporate with what Jude has said. So you'll be seeing Jude on our YouTube channel all over the place later, not just in this recording. But yeah, again, thank you very much, Jude. And thank you everyone for attending. I mean, the chat was just, give yourself a pat on the back. That was, again, exceeding expectations for participation. Well done. And I'm sure if you have any questions, you can address them to Jude and he'll be happy to answer.